I want to, before I sort of launch into this, I want to introduce Andy Lloyd.
Hi.
She didn't expect this.
No, she didn't.
But Andy is my partner as a fellow UCCer and also a fellow expert on environment and faith. And it was the two of us together who presented to our national body of the UCC the possibility of endorsing the Green New Deal.
Wow.
And it passed by 97%. So that's kind of where I wanted to begin this conversation. I know folks here are from all different kinds of faith backgrounds as well as different denominations. What I'd like to do is to talk for about 20 minutes, and then it sounds like we'll have about 40 minutes to go back and forth. And I hope that some of what I say in my opening will address some of the questions you may have come down here with, but I also expect that there'll be all kinds of stuff to talk about in our 40 minutes of conversation that will be related to the Green New Deal, but you may have other stuff as well, and I'm very open to exchanges about anything. Let me begin by setting the stage in the following way. Since the Paris Climate Accord was passed by 193 countries over 4 years ago, a lot has not changed, right? Each of the past 4 years has been one of the hottest years in history. The United States carbon dioxide emissions actually increased by 3.4% in 2018. The U.S. remains the only country in the world where a significant number of political leaders continue to deny the scientific basis of climate change and science itself. Fossil fuel companies continue to fund politicians and media campaigns committed to allowing us to continue business as usual. And business as usual for the fossil fuel industry includes plans, pay attention, over the next 10 years to spend $5 trillion on exploration and extraction of new fossil fuel resources. $5 trillion to kill us after we're dead. All right? I've never said that before. That came across pretty well, though, didn't it? Okay, but I want to point out three things have changed, right? First, concerns our denomination for this church and myself personally is the United Church of Christ. 2 years ago, right after Trump pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accord, 97% of UCC delegates at our National Synod passed a resolution that I wrote back then declaring that we need to understand ourselves as living in a new moral era. And our synod called upon the church to do two things. First, to resist the expansion of all new fossil fuel infrastructure, and second, to demand new sources of renewable energy that are accessible to all communities. The second thing that has changed is that millions of kids are now in the streets bearing witness for their right to grow up in a world not wrecked by climate change. 15-year-old Greta Thunberg is the most obvious example of that, and she has inspired, last month, 7.6 million students in over 6,000 cities to show up. So during our discussion, if you're interested, I actually have some printouts of her speeches, and I would be glad to share with you some additional quotes to what I had to say upstairs. In addition to the school strike, a group of teenagers known as Our Children's Trust, that's their website, Our Children's Trust, they have filed a federal lawsuit arguing that it's the duty of the government to protect the climate and that young people have a constitutional right to a world not wrecked by climate change. Last September, the United Church of Christ issued an invitation to have over 1,000 sermons preached on this court case. The court case has not yet been heard, so if your clergy person has not yet preached a sermon on Our Children's Trust, you have the opportunity to lobby him or her to do so. Now, the third thing that's changed is that in February 7th to be specific, the media began exploding with news of a proposed congressional resolution called the Green New Deal. So let me say a word about what the Green New Deal is and isn't. This is House Resolution 109. The Congressional Green New Deal is not a legislative document. It proposes no new laws or legislation. Second, what the Congressional Green New Deal is. First, it marks the first time Congress has been presented with an opportunity to act on the climate crisis by taking a vote that recognizes the scope of the challenge, the urgency of the crisis, the intersectionality of the numerous justice issues that are all amplified by climate change, and fourth, the opportunity to act on climate in a way that also addresses racial injustice, economic injustice, and the need to create clean, healthful, and family-supporting jobs that heal our planet. And finally, the opportunity to deploy solutions that address all of these challenges. So, I want to offer 3 reasons why our denomination endorsed the Green New Deal in such an abundant way. First, because the Green New Deal explicitly addresses the intersectionality of some of the most important justice issues our denomination has focused on for the past 60 years, and all progressive people of faith have been committed to for decades. It demands that the federal government address the injustice of climate change in a way that also tackles the, and I'm quoting, systemic injustices, that language is part of the House resolution, that disproportionately affect, again, frontline and vulnerable communities, including racial injustice, economic injustice, and the need to create clean, healthful, and family-supporting jobs that heal our planet. Second, the Green New Deal says we must assume moral responsibility for intergenerational harm. And it emphasizes the urgency of taking action on a comprehensive scale to reduce catastrophic future generations, the catastrophe that future generations would otherwise inherit. Third, the Green New Deal offers tangible hope in the face of threats that day by day are becoming more real for more and more people in the US and throughout the world. Or to put it another way, it's up to us to transform these threats into opportunities. Opportunities to create fair-paying jobs, to secure clean air and water, to redress manifestations of environmental racism, and to pursue a just transition to clean and renewable energy. So let me share with you just a couple of sentences on how different people have described the Green New Deal. The first comes from a Columbia law professor, Jedediah Purdy, who, by the way, second best name of the day, right? Jedediah Purdy, right? So this kid, I've been following this guy since he was a Yale undergraduate. He graduated from Yale at age 20. He was homeschooled in West Virginia. He is one of the most amazing minds alive today. Here's what he says about the Green New Deal. What is the Green New Deal but an explicit engagement with the value of life? An effort to secure a humane future for a world where we do not live by exploiting one another. Nice. Michael Brune, the executive director of the Sierra Club, with whom I have been in jail, says, it's a vision for our best America. I like that. And then another writer says, I'm trying to figure out who it is. Oh, it's Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley from Boston. She says, the push for a Green New Deal is about more than just natural resources and jobs. It's about our most precious commodity, people, families, children, our future. It's about moving to 100% renewable energy and the elimination of greenhouse gases. It's about ensuring that our coastal communities have the resources and tools to build sustainable infrastructure that will counteract rising sea levels, beat back untenable natural disasters, and mitigate the effects of extreme temperature. And then finally, Jeffrey Sachs, who's head of, also at Columbia, it's called the Earth Institute, I think, right? Founder and head of that. He says this, he says, listen, the Green New Deal, there are three main ideas. First, to decarbonize the U.S. energy system. That is to end the emissions of carbon dioxide from burning coal, oil, and gas in order to stop global warming. Second, the second main idea is to guarantee lower cost, high quality health coverage for all. Third, the third main idea is to ensure decent jobs and livable standards for all Americans, in part by making colleges and vocational schools affordable for all. He goes on to say the Green New Deal offers an economy that delivers a package deal. Good incomes, social fairness, and environmental sustainability. Around the world, governments are aiming for the same end, a triple bottom line of economic, social, and environmental objectives. So then people often ask, geez, is this Green New Deal feasible, right? Or is it just like too big? Is it just like dreaming? Mark Jacobson is a Stanford professor of civil and environmental engineering, and he's the one who had the main influence on the new California law passed last year requiring the state to use 100% carbon-free energy by 2045. California's committed to that. Jacobson is the major research behind that. Jacobson said that 80% of the Green New Deal's target for net zero greenhouse emissions across the economy could be achieved by 2030. Okay, 80% could be by 2030 and 100% by 2040 or 2050. He says you don't need any miracle technologies. We have all the technology we need. That, in some ways, that's like the most important thing to wrap our heads around. You mean, wait, the only thing keeping us from doing this is that we just keep doing what we've been doing? All we would need to do is like switch? That's it? I think it comes down to that. And I think that's just really hard for people to do, right? Okay, we'll get into that when we get into conversations. So why doesn't the Green New Deal explicitly commit to some form of carbon pricing? So my guess is in this room there are probably some people that for the past like 5 years maybe have been working really hard. We need to get a price on carbon. The Green New Deal is not in conflict with that. The resolution does not explicitly mention putting a price on carbon, but it does say explicitly the Green New Deal must involve, I'm quoting, quote, accounting for the true cost of emissions, unquote. That's in the language. So the advocates of one or another form of carbon pricing can read pricing, carbon pricing, into the words that I just said. But what the Green New Deal avoids is putting all the eggs in one basket of one model of carbon pricing. That's what they were trying to avoid. One commentator observed that the struggle over how or whether to prioritize pricing instruments, that struggle can come later. It doesn't need to be settled in advance of getting people to support the Green New Deal. So, what are American attitudes toward the Green New Deal? A July poll done by NPR, PBS, and Marist College shows that in the 5 months, that would be from February until July, since the release of the Green New Deal, the Green New Deal gained a higher approval rating than implementing a carbon tax and a higher approval rating than re-entering the Paris Climate Accord. Wow. In this survey of over 1,300 Americans of voting age, the Green New Deal enjoyed wide popularity among all demographic groups, including people with and without college degrees, white people as well as people of color, urban as well as rural Americans, and both people who earn less than and more than $50,000 a year. A whopping 86% of Democrats and 64% of independents favor the plan. However, only 26% of Republicans are enthusiastic about the Green New Deal. The ambitious plan has a higher approval rating than a wealth tax, a semi-automatic assault gun ban, free college tuition, and the only issue with the same level of approval is legalizing marijuana. That's great. All right. We have to find some way to laugh when we talk about this stuff, right? Now, here's the last poll that I wanted to share with you. Is that the Green New Deal this is a July poll. The Green New Deal is supported by 40% of white evangelicals. So you could view that both as positive or negative. I think that's so why is it important for clergy specifically to embrace the Green New Deal? And that's because clergy can make a difference. A 2015 poll conducted by Yale revealed that 2/3 of American voters think global warming is happening, and 2/3 of Americans rarely or never discuss it. How about that? And yet, 80% of Americans claim to be religious, and depending on what region of the country, and a sizable percentage actually show up in church. Not so much in Vermont, I realize that. But certainly, I was just speaking in Tennessee the other day, and it's a whole different culture down there. So clergy can make a difference. And I just wanted to, where did I put it? Maybe I have it here. I just wanted to direct your attention to a resource. Those of you that are connected with congregations, there's an organization called Echo America, and there's a sort of a subdivision of Echo America called Blessed Tomorrow, and that's for congregations. And they have so many good resources. This is their most recent resource for congregations. It's called Moving Forward, A Guide to Climate Action for Your Congregation and Community. And the advice in here is just absolutely terrific. I wanted to be sure you were all aware of it. So who are supporters of the Green New Deal? Well, every Democratic presidential candidate who's still kind of in the debate context is supportive of the Green New Deal. The Service Employees International Union, with over 2 million members, are in support of the Green New Deal. New York City, back in April, their city council had a vote of 45-2 to engage a climate mobilization plan, which is Green New Deal-esque in nature. And it is the most, it's the biggest commitment to carbon reduction of any city anywhere in the world. The most impactful piece of legislation, which faced strong opposition, particularly from the realtors, the real estate lobby in New York. It's an ambitious energy efficiency mandate requiring that the city's largest buildings cut their emissions by 40% by 2030, by 80% by 2050. The Dirty Buildings Bill, that's what they call it, the Dirty Buildings Bill, targets big luxury buildings, including the Trump Tower, that make up just 2% of the city's building, but are responsible for half of the city's emissions. How about that? Isn't that something? The act also includes bills that require studying ways to replace the city's gas plants with renewables, making green roofs, that is, with plantings and solar and wind on certain larger buildings, and calls for the state to deny a water permit for the proposed fracked gas carrying Williams pipeline, right? That's resisting fossil fuel infrastructure. It also also includes a provision to convert the city's school buses to all electric by 2040. You know, this conversion of all electric buses just reminds me, I just want to be sure all of you were aware of it, that Amazon, 6,000 Amazon employees joined Greta with the big school strike 4 weeks ago, and they were courageous enough to sign a letter, and as a consequence, that day, so they signed the letter and released it, I think it was on Wednesday before the Friday strike, and then 2 days later on the Friday strike, Bezos announced that I think it was by 2030, Amazon would have purchased 100,000 electric delivery vehicles. It was the biggest commitment to electric vehicles in the history of the world so far. And it happened because 6,000 people manifest courage, right? So that's the kind of thing that I'm hoping that everybody here is kind of thinking about personally for themselves. So what has the articulation of the Green New Deal prompted? Well, it prompted Bernie Sanders to put forward a climate plan that is a $16 trillion climate plan. This is an ambitious plan that is on the kind of scale that is actually needed. I'm not endorsing Bernie when I say this. I'm also not endorsing him, but my point is, that's the kind of scale and the kind of thinking we need. Kamala Harris said that she would eliminate the filibuster in order to get the Green New Deal passed. And a whole bunch of landscape architects, and I'm not saying that's a subgroup that, I don't know anything about that subgroup, whether they are very fluid in their thinking or very stuck in their thinking. But in any case, a whole group of landscape architects have written and signed a very important paper within that field saying we need to rethink our profession. And that's consistent with what I was saying upstairs about getting a new vocation. So how can congregations take action on the Green New Deal, right? So congregations can accept the moral responsibility that comes with living at a time such as this. And I want to make, this is the part you've been waiting for as my guess, I want to make like 8 suggestions, okay? And then we'll start talking. First, congregations need to learn about the science of climate change. The best way to, yeah.
Are your 8 suggestions going to be available to us in some form afterward, or do I need to like scramble to?
Oh, do you have a handout? Do you have a handout? Oh, get that man a handout. Who has extra handouts?
We ran out of them.
Did we run out of handouts? Wait a minute. Maybe I have some more.
Electronically, or I can look at it, but
Here you go. I just had one. It was in my cupboard. There you go. That'll help you. And the links. I typed out the links for this handout. Essentially so that I would have an answer to that question. My preference would have been to have sent this to you all electronically, but I haven't yet figured out a way to do that with these presentations, so I apologize for the paper. So the first thing is to learn about the science of climate change, and the best way to do that is to watch any of the videos done by Katharine Hayhoe. Her name is on the handout. She is arguably our United States #1 climate scientist now. She's the principal author of the every 4 years report that America is mandated to produce. Not the UN one, but the one for America. And she is also an evangelical Christian. Really? Her husband is an evangelical pastor. Really? Yeah, Katharine Hayhoe is the real deal. She's also, she just announced that she's writing a book. I just can't wait for that. Watch any of her videos. She's, I think, the best climate communicator alive.
How do you spell that?
Hayhoe, and her name is on that handout.
I don't see it.
Oh, it's got to be on there someplace, doesn't it? Oh, come on, it's not on there? Gee, you better write it down then. Hayhoe, Katharine, spelled with a K. Katharine Hayhoe.
And Jim?
Yes.
She's going to be preaching here in our New Light service in March by Zoom. So I forget the date, but if anyone's interested, let me know and I can let you know.
In this congregation?
Yeah.
And what do you mean by New Light service?
So we have a 4 p.m. Sunday afternoon service, and she will be joining us by Zoom one of the Sundays in March. I can't remember which, but I can let people know if you want to find me afterwards.
This is yeah.
gonna be awesome.
She might change your life. I mean, that's the kind of impact she has. Also, if you go to the United Church of Christ website, ucc.org, and you go into environmental justice, there's a video, a recording of a webinar she did nationally with the UCC on that as well. Okay, so second, we need to discuss climate change with increasing frequency at our houses of worship, at home and work, and our social encounters. And, you know, in a way, I'm not telling you anything, if you're in this room, that you don't already know. But I think most of us are a little reluctant to do that. It seems socially awkward and stuff. That's exactly the kind of thing that has to change. And you guys are change agents when it comes to that. And that's not easy. We can talk more about that in a moment. Third, regularly incorporate into your worship service a 2-minute testimony, and you could do it on any of these 3 topics, okay? First, how climate change is amplifying and accelerating a specific justice issue that your congregation is concerned about. So let's say for 20 years you've had a homelessness committee in your congregation. then have a testimony about how is climate change making homelessness worse, both in our community and elsewhere, right? So that's one topic. A second topic, how the U.S. already has all the technology we need to achieve all the goals of the Green New Deal. Now, that may sound a little wonky for like 2 minutes of liturgy in church or synagogue, but that's the kind of, I don't know, ramp up, the kind of touchstone that is appropriate in my thinking in a religious and worshipful context. Here's the third idea. How federal, state, and local agencies are developing and proposing new policies that impact our environment, and how members, people in the pews, can engage those agencies as advocates for policies and legislation that advance the goals of the Green New Deal, including a commitment to address systemic injustices, etc. So, in other words, to bring into your congregation an opportunity to connect for people that their faith obliges them to become advocates to change the laws. Now, particularly up here in New England, people get nervous when they start hearing that. And all we need to do is just take a step back and think about civil rights. The point of the civil rights movement was to change the law. The entire movement was run by church-based organizations and led by Ralph Abernathy and Martin Luther King, who were both ministers, right? So we need to recognize that can, and in my estimate actually must, happen here with this one. Okay, here's the fourth idea, action your congregation might take. Together with other congregations, your congregation can organize and convene a public meeting focusing on the Green New Deal and how it could increase local resilience. You can invite your mayor. You could invite your town council. You could put them on the spot in that public meeting. I know down in Stratford, which is the next town over to Norwich, where we live, activists, friends of mine, Gus Beth and others, have gotten onto their town council agenda the declaration of a climate emergency. And when 120 of us or so showed up on Fridays for the Future a couple weeks ago, at the main corner of South Stratford, every councilor, every city councilor in that little town was like astonished. They'd never seen so many people kind of protesting, if you will, or with placards. And so I would expect fully that within a month, the small Vermont town of Stratford will vote to declare a climate emergency. Here's another thing. You can write and submit an op-ed for your local newspaper, telling your community about why your congregation supports the Green New Deal, or that your congregation is at least discussing the Green New Deal, and lift up the reality that most people, regardless of their political affiliation or allegiance, support the Green New Deal. Those polls that I was just citing, lift up that reality. Here's another idea. If your congregation has a disaster preparedness group, many congregations are like if you get 5 inches of rain in 2 hours, it's like people rally to deal with what the consequences are of that in congregations. Well, have them learn how such responses from church are connected with climate change, enhancing or exacerbating those problems, which for decades probably your church has had a group like that. Here's another idea. You can identify ways your congregation can bring pressure to bear on elected officials to act with compassion and fairness by implementing a just transition for workers who may be currently dependent on fossil fuel energy. Now, we don't have too much of that in Vermont here, but we do have some of it, and you might be in a particular community where there is some kind of government enterprise, or it could even be private enterprise, that is dependent on fossil fuel profits and so forth. Here's another idea. There are dozens of congregations in my denomination where the congregation is now affiliating with what we would often think of as secular organizations, like the Sierra Club or 350.org. And what's happening is, like the Sierra Club is saying, wow, we never thought you were like interested in us, you know? And the congregation is saying, of course we're interested in you. You know, God is creator. Remember that creator, that part of the God thing? And so literally there are scores, and I think probably more like hundreds of congregations, in my denomination at least, that are connecting up in that way. And 350.org is now, I'm in conversation with the leaders of 350.org, and they really recognize that the faith communities can make a huge difference in this. And then there's sort of the obvious option of installing solar on your roof of your church. And then finally, urging your pastor to deal with climate change in his or her sermon on a regular basis. If you go to, there's a link, I think, on that handout that I provided that focuses on preaching on the Green New Deal. And that link has a whole bunch of suggestions for clergy as to how they might approach the Green New Deal from preaching. And finally, churches can reach out to the media and to elected officials, and you can draw upon the following talking points. Talking point number 1, the earth is the Lord's. Psalm 24, verse 1. And it's like as a society, we've kind of forgotten, oh yeah, people that go to church or to synagogue or to mosque, they sort of think that the earth is God's, not ours. That would be a good thing to remind media of. That as a person of faith, I recognize that the earth is the Lord's, not ours, to wreck. Second, that the urgency of this crisis demands immediate action. Third, that the scope of this challenge requires us to transform our whole economy on a scale without historic precedent. Next, that we can only solve the climate crisis if we also address racial injustice, economic injustice, and the need to create jobs. These are all moral issues. Next, that we owe it to our children and grandchildren to extinguish the fire that is now consuming the world in which we were born. And finally, that we already have at our disposal all of the solutions we need to address these moral challenges. So I'll leave it at that, and let's engage in conversation. We have half an hour, I think, for that. Please.
Yeah, thanks for firing us up. I do have some questions on the Green New Deal that I haven't heard answered. One is, doesn't itself, in creating it, create emissions? And won't it take 10 or 15 years to change the infrastructure to do that? And why have you left out the concept of stationary economy? Or, because I have kind of a passion that the real cause is our constant, got to grow.
So,
Can you repeat the question?
yes. That there are several aspects of the Green New Deal that I did not emphasize. And also, isn't it the case that transitioning to the Green New Deal itself kind of requires an extra amount of energy that is a challenge? But the first thing I want to lift up is the last comment that you made. In my book, I have a real emphasis on the need for congregations to become much more forceful in their advocacy for spiritual growth as an alternative to material growth. And I think up until now, we've never really thought of those as alternatives. But to your point, the days of material growth as a legitimate goal, that's over.
False God.
It's a false god. Thank you. You said it perfectly. It's idolatry, essentially. And as people of faith, we have, I was going to use the word tools, but that's the wrong metaphor. We have thousands of years of tradition upon which we can build a platform for spiritual growth that heretofore we haven't really had to pay that much attention to. So when we encounter a person like Mandela or Gandhi or something, we say, oh my God, what a great spiritual leader. I mean, we all have that capacity, actually, but because we focus on material growth so much, most of us forfeit that capacity in our lives. We need to make that transition. So that I wanted to emphasize that because I couldn't agree with you more on that. As for the transition for the Green New Deal itself, I mean, for example, let's just take electrifying public transit. To transition from what we got to that is very energy intensive. You're absolutely right about that. But at least I don't see much of an alternative. It's not as if it's still the case. Thinking about just transportation, I'm just focusing on that. It's still the case that people will need to move their bodies around. Now, as soon as those words come out of my mouth, I think to myself, wait a minute. If we did have 100% high-speed internet like Korea does, for example, 100% high-speed internet everywhere. In Vermont, I think it's only like at 82% right now, in terms of addresses in Vermont have high-speed internet, 82%. And we sort of think, well, that's a lot better than 50%. Maybe a digitized culture can relieve our transportation needs significantly, but they can't eliminate them. So yes, there is going to be an energy cost in making this transition. We can't avoid that, but I think we need to.
I agree. I'm just saying,
Yeah,
forgetting the other part, that we need to decrease
yeah,
other aspects.
that's right. We do. Please.
A comment on the spiritual side that you were talking about. I was caught by surprise by Wendell Berry several decades ago, was saying that it should be rural America that is leading it wasn't climate change then, but the awareness of climate degradation and the environment, because the rural areas are living in the middle of it. But the other thing was that I read that caught me by surprise was in his most recent book.
Wendell Berry's most recent book?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In which he says, we do have all the technology. He said, I'm worried we don't have the sense of community. Because if we don't have the sense of community, which becomes a theological question, because Christianity for so long has been individualistic, individual salvation, individual growth, that unless we get the sense of community, he said, we may get the technological change, but we'll fall right back into destroying ourselves because we've not built the community structure to undergird the technology.
So, did everybody get a chance? Could you hear that back there? Some of it at least? Yeah. So this is such an important point, and it doesn't surprise me that you're quoting Wendell Berry on this. He's just one of our deepest and most phenomenal visionaries and prophets, I think. I do want to pick up on what you're saying about community as opposed to individualism. That's part of the shift that we have to make, and I think houses of worship are a principal place, maybe the principal place where we can make that shift. Here's how I address it in my book and in every talk that I give, and that is we need to invite our clergy leaders to preach at least as many sermons on communal salvation as they preach on personal salvation. And if in fact you would take two highlighters, and one highlighter go through the entire Hebrew Scripture and New Testament, and in one color highlight all the stuff about personal salvation, like in yellow. And then you took pink, and you went, okay, what about communal salvation? Like the people Israel. That's communal. You all with me on this, right? And you use that. The ratio is about 50-1. And yet American religion has persistently, to your point, and Wendell Berry's point, has persistently focused, for no reason I can understand, on personal salvation. And it just seems absurd to me as a theologian, as a theological leader, that we continue to do that, and that's one of the fundamental pivots we need to make, because if sermons are persistently emphasizing this communal salvation thing, then churches and other houses of worship can become bases for the kind of communal basis that you're talking about. Please.
Well, we have to address that question.
Yeah.
Can I address it
Sure,
for you?
please.
I'm Alan Betts, and I'm a climate scientist. Been so for 50 years.
Speak loud, Alan.
All right, I'm Alan Betts. I'm a climate scientist. I've been that for 50 years. I attend a Methodist church in Rutland. And for decades, I have puzzled over the clash between what appeared to me as a non-theologian relationship of Jesus to the earth. And as Christian, for example, take that as an example, strategy. And finally, well, people ask me to preach on Earth Day, the one day a year. I come and talk about it. So I've done this to lots of churches. And I realized in the last just few years that I finally thought I understood what Jesus actually said. So, this winter I read what he said in the Aramaic in a book called The Hidden Gospel. And I'll use his name, Yeshua, for the Jewish teacher that he was. Yeshua. What did Yeshua actually say in an indigenous language, Aramaic? He basically said everything is connected. What we as a scientist call the Earth's living biosphere is a deep, interconnected reality. And what did he ask us to do? He said very simply, step into, in English we say the Father's world, but translate that as the creation, the Creator's world, the living biosphere. Step into that world as I do, and then you will get an understanding of the interconnectedness of all things. You will see that truth, you will understand it, and that truth will then set you free to act on behalf of the creation, rather than, in a current context, simply destroy it for all these things that have, for centuries, the churches and then our economic system have come to value above the creation itself. Now, think about that for a moment. That is exactly what we need to do as churches, synagogues, churches, and I'll maintain other religious and Native American and all the other traditions, it's much more obvious to them. We need to step into that world. We need to not just be individualistic. Community is a step in that direction. It's when two or more are gathered together in the name of the creation. There the spirit of everything is there. But it is also to step into the created world itself and reconnect, because it's a two-way interface. And I guarantee if you step into the creation long enough to feel that double connection, to listen, as you said earlier, actually listen to the earth talking to you, everything is changed. And we actually have to address that with our congregations directly. We have to be able to look people in the eye and say, yes, but that is not what Yeshua preached and taught. How, of course, and then we have to recognize for the Christian churches how we abandoned it. And you all know, it's all in the doctrine. At the Council of Nicaea, the choice was made to become the imperial religion of Rome. Utterly incompatible with what Yeshua actually taught, and they tried to destroy the Aramaic Gospels in favor of the Greek ones that had dualism and all sorts of concepts, separation of heaven and earth, which were not there in Yeshua's mindset at all. We have to be willing to face that, because that is business as usual for the Christian churches, all of them. And, you know, we've seen the struggle that Pope Francis actually understood this issue in his encyclical a few years ago. Gently he spoke about it. But if you read the minutes 4 years later on the US discussions of whether they had managed to accomplish what they challenged, the infrastructure of the churches, more than 90% of it, could not face what he wanted them to do. They could not face it. And that's true also of all our Protestant churches. And I can't speak for the synagogues because I'm not part of that tradition. But Yeshua was a Jewish teacher who understood what we need to do now. And we would simply relearn the basic teaching and be able to speak to that to our communities and churches. Yes.
I'm going to actually run the microphone. You're loud enough, I think.
Yeah.
I'll run the microphone to people
That's my
asking
wife. My
questions.
wife tells me that.
I meant that in a nice way.
You said it in a very nice way.
Well, shifting gears a little bit, I feel sorry to do that. I'm very thankful to Alan's witness there. But the thing what I bring to this meeting, and especially after your compelling presentation this morning, Jim, is the the tug of war between what the Green New Deal actually embraces, the crisis of climate change, and also the crisis of racism, endemic racism in this society. And in my mind, I just have trouble holding these two compelling priorities together. And how can I do both? For instance, I just read a review of a new Fortress Press book by a Lutheran black pastor, written in the form of a letter to white Lutheran congregations, and he says what every faith community that has a house of worship needs to do in sitting on a plot of land, they must right now research, backtrack down through the centuries where that land came from and how it was bought. And if there's any trace that shows that the money came from profits from slave labor, and then I would add also simply expropriating from indigenous peoples, they should make monetary reparations. And so, that's one priority, but here equally compelling, especially quoting Greta Thunberg, it's hard to hold them all together. So I wonder how you do that in 25 words or less.
So this is like the right question, right? And you're not alone in asking that question. My guess is pretty much everybody in this room has this exact question. And the most important response to this question is, thank God you are aware of that breadth. Don't let it paralyze you. Because sometimes we become aware of that breadth and we just shut down. And then when we shut down, we most of us continue business as usual, right? Which is, for most of us, not going to work. What we are called to be and to do is to bear witness in the world. And the witness we need to bear involves some changes. And it may be that particular change that you detailed in terms of reparations. It could be, as somebody witnessed to me upstairs, she was utterly astonished that neither Molly nor I talked about the impact of food, of animal agriculture on climate change and of eating meat. And I've been a vegetarian since 1970. Mm-hmm. I have eaten fish, but I often don't. But that's it. Haven't had any other than fish, any meat for 50 years. I never preached. When I was a local pastor for 20 years, I never preached on it. Everybody knew it, and I never preached on it. And I feel ambivalent about that. But you have a certain kind of a power when you get into a pulpit. You have a certain kind of a power, and I didn't want to do a trip on people, so to speak, right? We've all had ministers or other clergy that have done trips on us. Nevertheless, this whole business is about having a pivot in our hearts and then bearing witness. That's what is needed here. We need to do it individually. We need to do it communally. And we need to not get stuck by being overwhelmed by the fact that we are, in fact, living on the hinge of history right now. That's important. So thank you for your comment. I think you speak for a lot of people.
I guess I'm not quite sure how to express this, but you can't own the land that people walk on. I think that was how an indigenous leader expressed the thought. I think that the magnitude of this transformation, as you go through the steps toward realizing how huge it is, it would be too much. There's a Emily Dickinson poem about the truth, the blinding truth that you have to shelter people. I probably somebody here knows, could quote it, but to express the full truth of how big this transformation is going to be would be more than people could handle. And so that's kind of what I have trouble grappling with, what I need help with.
So, taking one step is, and the step that is your step, which is different than the step that is your step, and different from the step that is your step. That, to me, that's the most important thing. And then locking arms, when we come together for worship in our house of worship, locking arms and learning, that thing that I've been doing, it's just one piece of the puzzle, and I could never do what Fred is doing over here, but I'm so glad Fred is doing it. And hearing about Fred might help you 2 months from then say, maybe I could take a little move in Fred's direction on that one too. So to your final question, that's what I wanted to say. But in response to where you opened about owning the land, one of the questions, I'm so with you on this, one of the questions I raise in my book, what would happen if the largest landowner in the world were to turn all of its land into land trusts? That would be the Catholic Church. What would happen if, consistent with Laudato Si,
They fire the Pope.
as an expression, now, don't let this Methodist get out of control over here. I was raised a Methodist, that's how I know. What would happen if some huge sort of tectonic shift were to take place like that? I don't know, but I do know that many churches are taking seriously this question about the concept of land ownership. And it won't surprise me if a movement begins of individual churches somehow converting the ownership of their land into some kind of a trust. I don't know enough about laws of real estate to know that, but to your point. Andy, you're in charge of figuring out what order.
I've got an order.
I'm so glad. Oh, good. She's very orderly.
I want to shift gears again. I had the privilege of working with some Bennington College students on the strike 3 or 4 weeks ago. And in a debrief after, I was shaken by their despair and their, I don't know, it's hard to define how upset they were. And we'd had a brilliant strike as far as I was concerned, and they were going, nothing happened. Everything is the same. We had this pretty little demonstration, nobody got arrested, nothing. And so it got me thinking about the question that a lot of people are addressing now, and that's grief, eco grief. And that sense that I think a lot of us share, that it's just impossible. How can we go on? And, but trying to think through the idea of grief, because grief sort of indicates that you get through it. You get on the other side of it. You do the mourning. You change from being a wife to a widow, or from a child to an orphan. But you get past it, you go through it. And I don't think that's the right feeling. I don't think that's the feeling even that these students were expressing, which is, it's the go-to one. It's like, oh, they're in grief, so I know what to do about that. And I don't think that's it. So what I wanted to do was kind of pull apart grief, try to figure out what grief was about, what is it composed of. And I think the person to ask is a theologian.
Is that the question? There it is. So I can't remember exactly how many weeks ago. I think it was 2 weeks ago. It might have been 3. I was asked, believe it or not, I was asked to address the American Psychiatric Association.
Oh,
16,000 shrinks, right? Who went to a religion guy, a theologian, your final word there, because they are, this gets back to your point also about individual and communal. They are as concerned about the towns and regions in which their clients live as to the mental health, support and problems within that region as they are about their personal client. And they know the pastors and rabbis are in the same position in that regard. So we had a fantastic conversation. I wrote an article about it, and it's out now. And they're going to write a big article about it in their rag, for psychiatrists. But my point in starting there is to say it's not just a church thing that we understand grief and are focused on it. And oh, by the way, this is a whole different kind of grief. It's also a mental health concern. So I say that to triple underline what you have said. Second thing, and to the point of your question, is when I'm listening. So I've thought a lot about this. I've probably spent more time focusing on grief than any other single concept in the past 6 months, probably. And I'm listening to your question, and what I'm thinking is, yeah, this needs to become in a way, the new expertise of houses of worship. And it's not a new expertise, it's an old expertise, but it's not the same. That's your point. And we need new theology, we need new psychiatry, we need new kind of public mental health support for what it means to be now stepping into this discontiguous world in which, in a way, everything is up for grabs. And yet close enough to that time when it wasn't like that we grieve, having lost, and some of us, in addition to grief, have guilt for having blindly just kind of helped cause that transition. So I just want to double underline your thing. There is a new thing. We use the same word, grief. It is a new thing, and preachers and as well as mental health experts need to be paying new kinds of attention to it. Thank you.
Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, that's the order.
And we have 10
and we have 10 minutes.
We have 10 minutes.
I have an actual good thing that's happened. 2.5 months from now, if you were here, the electricity that's lighting us up would be coming from a community solar project that I have 1 foot in, and I have another foot in this church. And that's going to be pushing 70% of the power that this church needs.
Terrific.
That's all.
Yay!
I just have a suggestion on what churches can do. I think we've underestimated the power of the word.
Yes.
And I think we can do things liturgically that remind us to use a new language. And I share in the Quaker community that I'm in Hanover, we are required before every meeting to read a paragraph that says, "We are standing on Abenaki ground." And I think there are other groups that are doing that kind of thing, but it causes us, even when we're not thinking about what's going on, to get a pattern of words in our head that makes it not seem so shocking when we move to action.
Thank you for that suggestion. Being in the position I was in for 12 years in Massachusetts, I preached in a different church every Sunday. And it was such a lovely surprise when, not many of them, but maybe half a dozen or a dozen of them began their worship expressing gratitude to the Abenaki people or whatever the appropriate tribe would be. They began their worship that way. And the first time I heard that, I'm sitting up in the pulpit, in a fancy robe and stuff, I just started to cry. The first time I heard that. It can change things, hearing that. Thank you.
Okay, I want to go back to a theme we sort of touched on at various points, which is indigenous peoples. But I have to first admit to some guilt. Because 28 years ago, my husband and I went to Newfoundland, to the West Coast. And 14 years ago, we went to the East Coast. And our grandson, who is graduating from college this coming spring, and then planning to go directly into the Peace Corps, which sends terror through me, given that it's under the State Department, had heard so much about Newfoundland, he asked us if we would take him. So we went through this guilt thing about driving to Newfoundland, but we went. And this time we went to the West Coast again because that was his choice after he went through our materials. And what struck me about Newfoundland this time, and it's not, you know, I grew up in southern Vermont on a small farm, and I've lived many places in the country since then. And then we've returned to Vermont. So I'm not unfamiliar with the story I'm going to tell about the change in Newfoundland. When we were there 28 years ago on the West Coast, it was pretty uninhabited in the very northern tip of that remarkable island. And people were still living a fishing culture. This time, people, when we went, people were living a fishing culture in their memories and in their heads. And if you sat down and talked with them and listened to them, they'd tell you where they'd rather be. They'd rather be out on their boats, not sweeping fish out of the ocean, but catching enough to live. And what they've transitioned to, and admit it, is a tourism culture. So we need to recognize the impact that our curiosity and interest and love of the natural world, and we had wonderful ventures through that natural world, is having on the people who have always lived there. Just as many of us as Vermonters recognize the impact that the people from southern New England and New York and New Jersey have made on this state.
Thank you.
Hi, Jim. You've spoken a lot about the transitions that congregations can make, and especially in terms of perhaps solar power and the like. One of the things I was hoping you could do was address some ways in which congregations might address the transportation issue, which is now 45% of the state's carbon emissions. And there are, I just wanted to know if you've come across some good suggestions.
So a couple of things immediately come to mind. Several congregations I'm aware of have installed electric car rechargers as in their parking lots. And you know, your initial reaction to that might be, gee, that's a big capital expense. But the reality is that it sends a signal to the congregation itself and to the whole community. And you can publicly talk about it in a way that amplifies that signal. Another thing many churches are doing is having a ride share arrangement. There are now apps that you can get that your congregation could have a common app, and you can communicate to each other about sharing rides, so that instead of having 100 cars, or let's use a more reasonable number, instead of having 30 cars, come to a congregation on a Sunday morning. Maybe only 8 are needed, and that's because y'all are being intentional about communicating that. And then the final thing I want to say is that whatever shifts you might make that deal with transportation, in some ways the most important thing is to talk with each other about it. So if somebody buys an electric car in your congregation and they stand up and say, I bought a Tesla, like most of us think, oh, there he goes again, bragging. I don't have the money to buy a Tesla. So that's awkward, right? Can we all agree that that's like an awkward moment? And yet, the point is that as individuals, each of us in the next few years are going to make decisions. Some of them will be somewhat personally sacrificial. If we just keep hiding our light under the bushel, then that testimony aspect doesn't help others to say, you know what, Fred did it, I could do it. And we have to sort of rearrange our communication patterns that we do that. So those are all responses to your question. Thank you.
Can I comment
So-
on that one?
We're right at 12:30.
We're at 12:30, so I'm
And
not
we
sure
have-
we're going to have any time left
We're
to do
going to
anything.
extend it 5 minutes.
Okay.
We have 5 more
Just
minutes.
And so we have 2
Okay.
people in line, and
All right.
maybe we'll get to them.
Hi, thank you. My name is Steve. I'm a Unitarian Universalist, and I'm an institutionalist. I've been involved in the national UU environmental groups that pushed for climate statements more than a decade ago. I don't do that anymore. I've been a leader in my congregation, raising millions of dollars to build, to support the congregation and to build a beautiful new building. And my concern, I'm concerned about these institutions, faith institutions generally, and I'm wondering, both, I know we don't have a lot of time to have a group conversation, but if others in the room would like to have follow-up conversations around, so what do our congregations look like in 10 years? And how does that intersect with the issues around climate and energy? Because I'm thinking that, I mean, we know that our faith communities, as we've sort of traditionally understood them, most of the people in this room are dying. They're failing. Young people aren't participating in what we're doing, and so I'm becoming convinced that we need to be quite a bit different than we think of ourselves now in fairly short order. And if other people are interested and willing to have conversations about that, I'm trying to, I've been asked by my minister to help create that in our congregation, but I think it's a bigger conversation, and I would welcome other thoughts about that, both in Middlebury area, but also more broadly. Thanks.
And I would just double underscore what you have said, and one of my best friends is the head of the United Church of Christ, John Dorhauer, and he would agree with everything you just said. He's the head of our church, and he would agree with everything you've just said. We have to find a way forward in this regard. And getting back to the grief comment, houses of worship are going to be critical to human survival going forward. Not in the ways they have been, in ways we can't now imagine yet, but in a few years are going to become necessary. So I hope others of you will gravitate for that conversation.
And we're at 12:30, and the upstairs has come downstairs, and lunch is ready. So if you have an unasked question, you can find Jim during lunch, hopefully.
Yeah, I'll be back there signing books for a while, and then I'm going to disappear.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Okay.